Good morning, whatever it is. Look, tonight we've had a very good discussion. We spent the whole session talking about Britain, about our renegotiation, about our plans for an in-out referendum. And it was a very substantial discussion going into real detail in all the areas that I've put forward. I would say the good news is that there is a pathway to an agreement. And I'm confident of that after the discussion we had.
One of the things that was most, I thought, depressing in the campaign was a kind of overtone, particularly on the Leave side, of there is no place for and no room for and no relevance of what's called experts. That started out with Gove, who said, who needs experts anyway? That doesn't mean that the opinion of experts matters, but the description of how things are, for that you have to be with experts. But it's amazing, once people are in their own interest, their own personal interest, required to find out how things are working, they will find out. The problem with the EU referendum is that it's not that clear how it relates to your own personal interests. Yeah? And whether we personally are advantaged or disadvantaged by being member of the European Union. But if, look at HSL2 as an example of the country. As soon as there is this whole planning process of the high-speed line to the north, people in all kinds of local areas, even a single street, know exactly what their rights are for appeal and how to get compensation for if the value of their house goes. They will find it out. But if you say, how does the EU or not being in the EU affect the property value of my house, or these at this moment are very difficult to pin down, and therefore it's also not very rewarding for people to say, well, I spend a hell of a lot of time on it, and therefore they don't know that much about it. Huh? But as soon as people have a direct stake in something which is clear to them how that stake is organized, they find out how to get the relevant information, and they will listen to experts, and they will heed factual knowledge.
The Remain campaign was appalling. Unfortunately, to a degree, it pandered to the idea that the EU is bad for Britain. So, whereas the Leave campaign had basically campaigned to say that the EU was bad for Britain, I think the Remain campaign, instead of saying no, the EU is good for Britain, it kind of said, well, it's not as bad as all that, and really failed to stand up for the EU and the benefits of the EU. And quite clearly it was one of the most appallingly misjudged campaigns in political campaigns in the history of Britain.
Gather round, friends, there's something I want to talk to you about. I can see by all your faces that you're all good people, fine upstanding members of your community, what we used to call white men before the PC Brigade took over our parade and made us afraid to say what we think. And we got problems of every size. Economy. Yeah. Energy. Yeah. Ecology. Yeah. Ethnography. Yeah. Only kidding. So what do? Take responsibility? Well, how do we do that? I'm glad you asked me, friend. What if I told you there was a common cause? You see, we got problems. Right here in Blighty. Problems with a P, and between you and me, that stands for pause. Yes, immigration. Yes, the scourge of our nation. It's time for Britain to take back control.
For me, it was certainly a crisis of identity because it very much feels like a betrayal of everything that I believe in, that I work for, of my very identity. It's an assault on my identity in the sense that as a historian of religion, I focus on interactions between cultures. As a citizen, of Germany, of Europe, I feel like exchange between cultures is what helps humanity. In that sense, the vote to leave a functioning union is really a step back into the old age of nationalism, and there's no way around that.
You see, what really winds me up is that they keep saying that the people have spoken.
Yeah, the will of the people, which is, again, if you hear that as somebody socialized in Germany, it gives you a certain bellyache, because the will of the people, of course, was to have the total war, right? And the Nazis were wonderful in evoking this. I'm not saying that, anybody who says that, the will of the people needs to be done would be a fascist, but I am saying that the will of the people is a construct that needs to be carefully considered, and if the people are given false information, then I don't think we can truly speak about the will of the people. With all due respect to the necessity to implement the results of a fair referendum, that's different. Had it been a fair referendum run on truth, then I would say, well, it's a silly idea, let's do it. But if it's based on falsehoods, then it's a silly idea that was not the will even of that part of the population that voted, because they were simply given false information, and that's the long and the short of it.
Now I know you all know there's as many immigrants living in this country as there are expats living abroad, just as surely as you know that we don't lose £350 million a week to the EU. But that's not the point. It's mighty tough facing up to the challenges of the modern world when there's a scapegoat right here in Blighty. I tell you what, folks, how about you let me be the daddy you never had, and daddy says don't worry yourself about taxation for the rich, or the state of the NHS, or climate change. Let's just keep the poor fighting amongst themselves, shall we? Yeah. Like in the good old days.
I think the use of propaganda in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, especially by the Leave campaign, is really, really interesting. There are two examples in particular that I would point to that to me really summarize how that worked. So one is the idea of the NHS, which featured really prominently in the Leave campaign. So the idea is that at the moment our tax pounds go to some anonymous institution in Brussels and are then redistributed, and a lot of money comes back to the UK, but through a set of procedures and mechanisms which are not very transparent. So while, I think a lot of people understood that the UK is getting a lot of money back, it didn't feel like something that made a difference to our own lives, that really spoke to our lived experience. The NHS is completely different, right? We're born in NHS hospitals, we've all been treated by NHS doctors and nurses. They're lovely, they're caring. So giving money to the NHS feels like you're directly contributing to creating a better, more caring society and an institution that you've had immediate contact with, that is part of your own lived experience. And I think substituting the anonymous structure of the EU for something as concrete and tangible as the NHS was a very effective propaganda tool for the Leave campaign.
My friends, you got problems right here in Blighty. And the problem's not you and the problem's not me, it's that guy there. And while I'm joking, the mob has spoken, the white working class is awoken. We got problems with a P-O-L-E-S, and that stands for polls. Thank you.
The other image that really stuck in my mind from the Leave campaign was that poster called Breaking Point. So this was an anti-immigration poster which showed a kind of a curving mass of traveling people that look distinctly other. They look foreign, dark hair, dark skin colors, they look vaguely Middle Eastern. It's not specified on the poster where they might come from, who they are, but that's in a sense not the message. The point is that they look alien, and the fact that they're arriving somewhere en masse makes them a threat. It's a threat to our communities, our values, our way of life, and again in a very tangible, concrete sense, that which we know, with which we're familiar with, and which is now potentially threatened and disrupted by the arrival of countless others who bring a different cultural background, different languages, different religiosities, that might disrupt all that which we know and hold dear. So much the same way as the NHS speaks to lived experience and our personal memories, I think this image speaks to longer term collective memories. And there's some really interesting historical parallels one could think of here in terms of politicians, propaganda conjuring up that fear of amorphous masses from the East to a threat to our Western civilization. A particularly notorious example of this would be Nazi propaganda, for example, the 1940 film The Eternal Jew, Der ewige Jude, which famously showed lots of pictures of impoverished, destitute Jewish people huddled together in ghettos, moving in masses, interspliced with pictures of rats in sewers, so suggesting these people are dirty, they're not even properly human, they're a bit vermin-like, and this idea of the kind of the mass movement is really integral to that imagination. Also that they're in the East and they're therefore the other and a threat to Western civilization.
Winter is over, the leaves have turned green, but red is the colour you'll see. For Britain's foraging against the machine, thanks to the UKIP.
The interesting thing, of course, about this poster is that it has virtually nothing to do with the European Union. The migrants depicted are migrants from Syria or more broadly from the Middle East, fleeing those terrible conflicts and seeking shelter in European countries, especially in Germany, where Angela Merkel's government decided to have a relatively open door policy towards Syrian migrants. But at no point was there suggestion that freedom of movement within the EU meant that the UK would have no control over its borders when it came to non-EU citizens, such as those refugees. And as we know, hardly any of them were admitted into the UK. Those who tried were stuck in transit camps and still sitting in Calais in rather desperate conditions, and nobody's ever let them into the UK. So what is being played upon here is a fear of the other, and especially the Eastern other, which speaks to, again, to very old and visceral memories and fears that people already have. They tend to think that their different values and beliefs and emotions are a coherent whole. We don't like contradictions. So we think of our fears and our anxieties that we all have as part of a wider worldview or belief system. So yes, propaganda often speaks to fear, but there's always the flip side that you're valorizing a particular idea of community, of security and so on, whilst you're conjuring up a fear of the other.